COVID-19 changed the world in 2020. A highly contagious, rapidly spreading virus forced people to isolate themselves from loved ones and stay indoors. In the early part of the pandemic, there were still a lot of questions about how the virus spread, how serious it was, and most importantly, how long would we all need to isolate from one another? 2 weeks quickly turned into 2 months to 3 to 4. There was no end in sight. Workplaces switched to remote operation, leaving only those deemed essential to return to the workplace. And humans, the social animals that we are, turned to things like drive-by celebrations and video chat to stay in touch. Apps like Zoom, House Party, and other video conferencing apps soared to popularity. There was a strong desire to keep that face-to-face contact, and we adapted these practices rather quickly in order to keep sane in our new norm. But it wasn't just work and socialization that needed to make a drastic change. One of the things hit hardest by the pandemic was the school system. Schools around the country were forced to make a sudden and jarring shift to distance learning, and they were forced to make that change overnight. Now, from what I saw in the media and what I heard from a few teachers that I know firsthand, is that school districts didn't really handle this shift very well. Now, I'm not currently an educator or a parent of a school-age child, but I am a student enrolled in a distance learning master's program, and I do have expertise in telecommunications. So my main question is, why? Why did school districts have this hard time switching to distance learning? I mean, for instance, right now, I'm not even in my control room. I'm in my basement, in a world that is already so connected through all of our devices. Why did teachers struggle to connect with their students? And in a world where I can find expertise with just a few short search words, why did we struggle with authentically learning? In a world where so much of our life has already shifted to online, why the struggle with schooling? In the first part of this documentary, I'm going to take a look at the initial shift to distance learning and then how it grew in 2021. I did get a chance to talk with some educators both in person and on video conferencing apps, so let's hear what they had to say. Thank you for joining me in the studio today. I really appreciate it. Now, just to start off, could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Nicole Passaretti. I teach in Queens for the New York City Department of Ed, and I taught 5th grade, and now I'm an instructional coach.
Hi, I'm Seth Bushing. I work at New Rochelle High School in Westchester, New York. I am a house principal. I oversee about 800 students in my house out of a 3,200 student building. I am also the technology liaison for my building, and I'm the master scheduler for my building, as well as the data coordinator for my building.
How did your school first handle the shift to distance learning?
My school is a Google Classroom school, which is, we had no digital learning before the pandemic started. So even like access to technology in my school was really poor. We had probably less than 100 laptops for 1,100 kids before the pandemic. Like, we had no technology going on in my school. So once the pandemic started, we switched to digital learning very quickly. We used Google Classroom, and then as the pandemic kind of moved on, we started using things like, Pear Deck and Kami and all these other tools that are available to support that distance learning.
We did. We were actually one of the very first in the state and in the country to shift to distance learning, because if you recall, New Rochelle was ground zero for the pandemic, and the National Guard rolled in and they made a very big deal out of it in the media. It was actually very low key in reality, but we did shut down very early and switched over quickly to a distance learning model. It took about 2 weeks for us to actually close down, if I'm recalling correctly, after things really hit off. And we assumed that we would be out for about a week. I believe we actually had a few days off as we were planning and figuring out how to get devices to students. And then we started having students come and have families come and pick up the devices in the parking lots of the building. We're distributing them with like, all tents and tables outside, people in hazmat suits handing out Chromebooks and things. So I want to say within a week we had pivoted to fully online. And then, of course, that's when everybody started to realize how big of a deal this was. And we knew we were not coming back in a week. And we probably weren't coming back in a month. And it turned out we weren't coming back for over a year.
My school was really good. My school handled the shift to distance learning very well, I feel like. We had to go in, they shut schools down, I believe it was March 13th of 2020, that all schools were shut down. And teachers had to go in, just teachers, on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the following week. And in that time, they made sure we could contact all parents, connect all emails to the parents so that we could set up the Google Classroom. And then after that, we worked. They gave us time to work with our colleagues, and we set up lesson plans, and we set up things for the students to do. At that point, it wasn't where we had to go on live. We didn't have to go on live, but we had to set up work for them.
It was a bit of the Wild West in the worst of ways. This district had already rolled out Google Classroom. Everybody had Google Classroom already up and running. We're a Google district through and through. Everything is Google Suite. But no one could be compelled to use Google Classroom. We also can't compel any individual teacher to use a certain gradebook or any number of things, but particularly when you get into technology, there's a lot of teacher choice, which is great in terms of flexibility and creativity. It's terrible in terms of standardization, and in a distance learning environment is a nightmare for families trying to figure out how to make things work when different teachers are doing things differently, from the platform down to the method of delivery of instruction.
So the biggest challenge was trying to find the new ways to do what we knew how to do. Really, in the spring of 2020, there really wasn't much assessment being done. Really, the purpose that we had at that point was just making sure everyone was okay. Like I said, the area that I work in was very hard hit by the pandemic. I work very close to Elmhurst Hospital, so things were really kind of bad over there. So in that spring, it was really just making sure everyone was okay. We did what we could do. We gave, the end of year test. We said you could print it out, you could take pictures, you could do, we made things very flexible for the students.
The biggest challenge, I think, for me with online learning was that I'm not very, I'm not into technology. I kind of stink at it. So for me, having to learn, I guess it's not a challenge, though. I guess it's better for me. It forced me to learn technology, which I feel like is great. So I learned how to not only just put a Google Meet up, I learned how to share my screen. I learned how to go onto the internet and grab the Foundation interactive tools online and use them for my kids so that they were able to really see what I would do in the classroom.
Did your school provide adequate professional development opportunities for teachers to learn about educational technology?
A little bit this year, more so last year when I was still a classroom teacher. I was a lead teacher, so myself and another lead teacher at my school did coffee talks on Friday mornings, and we worked with a lot of teachers on ways to improve their instructional practice through different online platforms and just how to reach more students using the digital learning platforms. So my school, I provided most of the learning for the teachers, but in the beginning, in that spring 2020, not much was offered because really the entire city was trying to figure out how to do it. But there were, as as it moved along, there were professional learning opportunities for teachers provided by like Queens North or like from the DOE, not so much from my school.
In addition to being a house principal, everybody has, there's like a supervisor of security and such. So I have done a number of the, virtual demos of how to use different things. Just a lot of bulletins and memos regarding the best practices in terms of, Zoom settings and such to make sure that, like private messaging is off and make sure that, you can't save the chat, just like all those lists of things, sending them out in regular reminders and memos and updates just to remind teacher of what best practice is, and then also give them an inroad if they want to connect further. It's tough, and you don't want to and should not blame the teacher because they're being asked to do something that they've never been asked to do before, and being online, they didn't have the support that they normally would have.
So clearly there were some hiccups in the beginning. After all, schools were shifting to distance learning out of necessity, not by choice, and they had no time to prep. So you got to cut them a little slack there. I wanted to get another viewpoint on this subject, so I thought I'd ask some students what their experience with distance learning was.
Hi, I'm Alexis Casano. I go to school at Locust Valley High School and I'm a senior. When the pandemic started, I was in the 10th grade.
Jackson Saavedra, 2nd grade. Well, I didn't really like it. I missed my friends, and it took up like a lot of my time. It's just that the stuff that I do after that I have to do as my homework, it just took a lot of time because I'm not used to doing it on an iPad.
I enjoyed the distance learning. I feel like it could have definitely been done better, but if we could advance and improve that type of learning system, it could be very useful. So our school was very proficient in technology already, so we were already using Google Classroom. So when we integrated into the online learning system, we just went on Google Meets instead of being in the regular classroom.
Yes, we did that to go on Zoom if we had to meet somebody, and we also had an app that our teacher can assign us like things to do. They didn't have all of the usual things they can do because they stayed home, which means they don't have all the stuff they can use to teach up normally, so they didn't really like it.
Well, some teachers used it better than others, and then some of the other classes were just optional to go to. I was in AP English during my sophomore year, and when the pandemic hit, she was very lax. She was very relaxed about it. So I didn't go to that class, but I still passed, yeah.
Now, I also wanted to see what the parents had to say about this switch to distance learning. After all, school and home were two separate institutions for such a long time, and now they were merging. I also had the chance to talk to some educators who are also parents of children in school.
So my name's Carlos Saavedra, father of 2 boys, one that's 7, one that's 12. They both go to Floral Park School District. One's in 2nd grade and one's in 7th grade.
Hi, I am Matt Karinga. I'm a full-time faculty member, associate professor of educational technology. I teach in the program in educational technology. We're also starting a new master's in STEAM teaching and learning, where I'm overseeing a track in computer science education. So, that's my general background. I teach course in computer science, multimedia production, digital media theory, that kind of stuff.
Now, you have 2 kids in school, correct?
Yes, I have 2 kids. They're in 8th grade and 10th grade right now.
Hi, I am Michelle Casano. I am a teacher for the New York City Public School System. I teach kindergarten, and I'm also a mother of a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old. When the pandemic first hit, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for my children, I feel, to learn. They posted a lot of work that was expected to be completed, which was difficult for me for my son, because he wasn't the type of child that will go on and just complete assignments. It was me having to sit on top of him. So for me, it was negative because there was no like accountability of having to join a Google Meet or sign on for class each day.
Biggest thing was the Google Classroom. I guess not so much for my youngest, but for my oldest, which they didn't really get too much training, or they didn't really work with them on how to find their assignments. Because a lot of the times my son would say he did his homework, then next day teacher would get an email from us or from them saying, oh, he missed his assignment. We'd go back to his Google book. Sure enough, he didn't see it, or he didn't know where to find it. So that was a big thing for him. He needed to learn how to use the iPad, not just for doing his work, but to trying to retrieve his assignments, quizzes, tests, projects, which he didn't really do in the beginning of the school year. And then they didn't really show it to him in the beginning. So he kind of had to try to figure out on his own, because we didn't really know either. The technology was really kind of over my head, over my wife's head a little bit. But then little by little, we started to figure out how to kind of help him a little bit along the way. But then he finally got the hang of it.
Definitely one thing that helped them was that they had already had the Google domains for education set up, and everybody at the school knew how to log in, access their accounts. So every teacher wasn't using Classroom already, but every single person in the school had access to it to get started. They also have a very strong, they call it crew, like homeroom kind of, but more intensive. So they have a lot of opportunities to talk to the kids just casually and for them to work together. So I think that helped to smooth things over and get the word out of what they were trying to do.
Their grades probably dropped a little bit, at least my youngest. He had a little issue reading. I guess he wasn't on reading level per the school district. So that kind of took a hit when he wasn't in school fully. We were doing the hybrid schedule. Kind of lost a little bit of self-esteem, was kind of down on himself as he wasn't where his classmates were. So I don't know if that was really hybrid issue, but I think at least for my son, my experience, he's better being in school, getting taught, as opposed to being, through remote learning. Even though he was learning and obviously doing well, I feel like him being at school, being around his friends, in front of his teacher, getting that social aspect of school, I think that's where he does better.
Clearly, schools had a hard time with the sudden shift to distance learning. But luckily for them, by the 2020-2021 school year, it seemed like they had it a bit more under control.
But I had the opportunity of 2021, which was my last year as a classroom teacher. I taught from school, but I taught a remote class. So during that time, I assessed their reading levels. I did everything business as usual. Some things took a little longer than they would have. I do think that I succeeded because I was given the opportunity to build that curriculum online. I also feel like with being remote and doing the distance learning, I was given a little bit more flexibility than sometimes you're given within a school. A lot of times they want you to follow the curriculum and do this and do that. I was really able to look at the New York State learning standards and tailor the instruction that I gave to my students to the standards and not necessarily the curriculum.
By September, we had implemented a new bell schedule that involved a brain break, where sometime mid-morning, every student and teacher had like a 30 or 40-minute break, just no classes, no nothing. My initial suggestion, although it would have been such a huge change, I know why we couldn't go down that road at that time, was to move to block periods and just totally take the opportunity to revitalize and overhaul our bell schedule and just our mode of operating. Unfortunately, in terms of how a master schedule works, it was just too complex of a change to be making while teachers were also learning how to use these platforms and students were just trying to figure out where they're even supposed to be.
The middle school where my kids go, my son actually switched to high school. So he started his first year of high school in that environment. But the middle school They took 1 day a week for in-person. That was just for the students that were struggling the most, to get them to come in and have face-to-face time with the teachers. And then they had 100% online cohort, and then a hybrid cohort that would come in, 1 or 2 days a week. It was definitely more formal. And the push was for one to return to in-person instruction as much as the health situation would allow, which wasn't very much, but to at least let some kids be in some schools some of the time. And then much more focused on synchronous learning. I don't necessarily think it was better for my kids, but probably overall it was better because they had more of a handle on what was going on. It was more formal. I don't know if it was better or worse, but they had a more systematic approach to it.
So my kids were in the same school. One was in kindergarten and one was in 5th grade. My youngest, they had opposite schedules. So when one was home, one was in school, or it could have been they're both at home. So depending on the week, their schedules would change. When the cases were going up and there were COVID cases flying around the school, then yeah, when there wasn't the same instructional learning for the home kids who were at home as opposed to kids who were in school. So they didn't have the same teacher. They'd have somebody else giving them assignments, but not the same instructional from their same teacher. So that was kind of tough, yeah.
There was a separate teacher for the online portion?
They had a sub or like a teaching assistant who would help them with that if they needed to be there, yeah.
We did have a majority of teachers who were remote only. I was actually in person, but I was closed down a bunch of times. So they did make changes, and they did have assessments for us to use.
In the beginning, I felt that writing was very hard to teach online. But then once I got my students working on like shared docs and how to access like the comments that you can make and you can highlight, I actually felt like it was a more efficient way to teach them writing. And really, I think that take the pandemic out and all the stress and just being like thrown into figuring out how to teach distance, like do distance teaching, I actually think it's a more effective way of teaching. You are able to work with small groups of students without having to manage the other students in the class. Last year, as a 5th grade teacher with a complete remote class, at times I had 43 kids in my class, 41 kids in my class, 45 kids in my class. I ended the year with 38, but it was so much easier to differentiate work and assign assignments that were appropriate for this group's reading level or that group's reading level or their interest level or something that, by the end of 5th grade, I had a group of like 12 students working on a public policy analysis on a topic that they chose. In the beginning, things were very hard to teach, but as the year went on, and it was a lot of trial and error, but overall, I think that the students did better than they would have in the classroom.
Clearly, distance learning did get a bit stronger in 2021. Now that schools had a little bit more time to prepare, they could strengthen the things that work and weed out the things that didn't work. But I still don't feel like distance learning reached its full potential. And now that we're at the tail end of this pandemic, I'm worried that schools might revert completely back to the old ways and forget all the lessons we learned with this distance learning model. So in part 2 of the documentary, I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about equity among students and also where I think distance learning could go in the future.